Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Campfire Stories, Volume 3, Story Number 1. The only thing I can think of happened years ago. This is back when it was okay to build permanent tree stands nailed into trees. I had scouted out a few in a new area and settled where I wanted an oak flat joined a big thick swamp. It was pretty open except one grove of high palmettos and brush that came from behind my stand and went into the swamp. I was able to climb into a fork of an oak tree by climbing a small dogwood next to it. After hoisting up my wood and nailing up a very stable platform and seat about 15 to 20 feet up, I dumped out some corn and left. This was in the summer as I was hog hunting. It was 2 weeks before I made it back to hunt. Everything was fine as I walked in before daylight and got settled in. I noticed the corn was gone and lots of fresh hog signs that I could see by my small light. After everything got quieted back down, I sat in the dark, but I kept having the feeling of being watched. Now, I have hunted, camped, and grew up in the woods, and I'm completely at home, day or night. The darkest, deepest swamps, and never felt this feeling before. I wasn't scared because I didn't know to be. I just couldn't put my finger on it. The feeling never changed, but I couldn't get used to it. I was just on edge, I guess. I never saw or heard any animals that morning that I can remember till I was climbing down about mid-morning. I had lowered my rifle and was in the process of slithering from the oak to little dogwood when I saw something out of the corner of my eye about the same time I heard it. I heard the crash and just barely caught sight of something running through the palmettos parallel to me. Now, I say barely because it looked like a huge brown dog. Honestly, I thought buffalo instantly. How crazy is that? It crashed through the thicket, and I heard it hit water. Sounded like a herd of hogs plowing through. I wrote it off as a deer that jumped, and I was just glimpsing it, which made it look different. Well, I thought about it, that sight, and the feeling that I had all morning, and as I drove back home to do a little work before hunting again that evening, I kept thinking about what I saw versus what I was feeling. Around 2 or so that afternoon, I was again walking back into that stand, still thinking about the oddness of the morning. It was only a quarter-mile or so walk, and I was there and settled in quick enough. Again, everything was oddly quiet. I had been sitting maybe an hour or so when I heard the faint splash of hogs, I assumed, across in the thicket inside the swamp. As it got louder, instead of that excited, eager feeling you would normally get, I was getting nervous. It was so weird because I had never felt that way before. Well, what I thought were a bunch of hogs turned out to be one single critter. When it was within 100 yards, I could hear it so plain and clear. Whatever it was in no hurry and stayed out of sight on my blind side across the thicket. I scouted all this out, and I knew the water that it was in was waist deep on me, and this thing was picking its feet or legs clear of the water as it walked. I could hear the splash, drip, 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 splash, as it put one foot in front of the other, real slow, like it was trying to be quiet. I thought it might be another person till I thought about how deep that water was. I would never point a gun at a noise or anything I wasn't planning to kill dead, but as that noise got louder and got to the edge of the thicket, I was looking down the barrel. Still unsafe and finger off the trigger, but still, you gotta know me to know how serious this must have been. I was actually shaking. While it got the edge of the water and was about 40 yards of thicket before the ground opened up between us. It crashed at about 10 or 15 yards and then went quiet. Deathly quiet. No sound, no frogs, no crickets, no birds, no nothing. I might have imagined it, but I thought I could hear something every now and then, like it was slipping in on me. It was getting dark by then, and to say I was shaken would be an understatement. I never saw or heard anything else that evening, but I walked out backwards right before dark. I was so put off by it, I had forgotten my bag, my fanny pack, hanging on a nail in the stand. I realized that while I was driving home, I told my granddaddy about it that night, and he of course made fun of me. If all that wasn't bad enough, here's the crazy part most folks don't believe. It was 2 days later before I got the nerve to go back up and get my bag. I carried a shotgun this time as I felt more secure with it, though I doubt I could have hit anything at this point. It was an old rabbit ear, and I kept my thumb on the hammer the whole walk in, and of course I went in midday. I kept my eyes peeled as I slipped in towards my stand. Like I said, it was pretty open except the thicket, which would be on the other side of my stand from where I was coming in. I got about 35 yards or so from my stand and glanced up. It was gone. I don't remember seeing it piled on the ground below, but it was not in the tree. I could see white all around where it was like the bark had been scratched and clawed all to hell. And my bag was still hanging on that nail. I never looked back, and to this day, I have not been back to that swamp. A few years after my little incident, it was all clear cut, and part of that swamp was filled in. There are houses there now. I've told a few people about it, but I usually have to drink a few to talk about it. Only one person has believed me, but he won't tell me why. He also hunted the general area, and I think he might have had a run-in with something as well. Not really asking anyone to believe this, just thought I would tell it. I have heard of plenty more strange things around these parts, but I'll save them for another day. Story number 2. You know about those gut feelings of something being wrong, being watched, or someone seeing danger always freak me out, but I did have a strong sense to get the hell out of Dodge one day while sitting by a little river deciding whether I wanted to fish or not. I had just got my back off and found a spot to sit when I had that odd feeling of being watched from behind. I got up and moved downstream about 400 yards to a spot where there was a larger clearing between the river and the taller brush and the other trees. I did not see or hear anything while walking, only some old deer tracks in some rutted mud. But when I got to looking at a spot to sit for a while, I got that feeling again. I could see pretty good all around me, about 100 to 175 yards, and just thought that I was being silly. I ate some of my food that I brought and watched the area around me as I tried to figure out which lure to use. For a while the feeling went away. I fished for about an hour with no luck, and I needed to go pee. So I stood up and walked back into the bush to take care of business. While standing there, that feeling came back stronger than before. All I could hear was my pee hitting the ground. No birds, no wind, no little critters of any kind. I finished and went back to my spot. I got there, I bent down to pick up my pole, and I heard my dad's voice call my name out loud and clear, using a tone of voice that meant I was to do what he told me to do, and to do it now and ask no questions. My dad had passed away 3 years before. Like others have said, instantly, every cell of my body was all keyed up. The area I was in is known to have bears, mountain lions, and wolves, who were just starting to make a comeback. But I had not seen any sign or heard from anyone else that they had been in that area for a while. I grabbed my stuff and packed my bag as quick as I could. This time, I took my Smith & Wessons out of my backpack that I brought as extra weight in the pack, and 4 snakes, and put it on my hip. Normally, I don't like to open carry like this. As I put my pack on, that feeling of danger got even stronger. I started back to my truck the way I came in and froze solid after a few steps. I could not go back the way I came in. I stood there and listened and watched for about 10 minutes and heard nothing. The river was running slow, so it hardly made a sound. I looked all around me, and every time I looked back up the trail I had come in on, I got more and more nervous. The trail looped around back to my truck, but it was about a 2-mile walk versus a 3/4-mile walk the way I came in. So I went the long way back, and when I got to my truck, something had been there and scratched it up pretty good on the driver's side and the tailgate. I don't have a clue what it could have been because I was in a designated parking spot that had just been re-graveled. There was scuff marks, but I could not find anything that looked like a print from a man or animal. That feeling of danger did not go away until I had driven up to the top of the ridge and was just about back onto the pavement. When I did get back to the main road, there was a game warden and a sheriff deputy parked talking there, and they were kind of blocking the road as I pulled up, and they got out and walked over to my truck to talk with me. The conversation started normally. I told them I was fishing with no luck down at the river, so I decided to come back, and when I mentioned my truck had gotten all scratched up while parked, they got quiet, lost their smiles, and looked at each other. They asked what time I parked and which way I went up or down river and if I noticed anything around the parking lot. I said I saw some scuffs in the gravel but nothing else. I did not say anything about weird feelings. Again, they looked at each other and said, "Okay, have a nice day," and went and moved their trucks off the road. This all happened between 10 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. in May of 2005. I never went back as I moved further away by the end of June. I would have just thought I was being paranoid, being out there by myself, but the way those two cops acted made everything else feel even stranger. I would like to go back someday, but I'm going to take a buddy along, and of course, maybe my shotgun. Next story. I've got a couple of little stories that stand out in my mind. First one took place when I was about 14 or 15, and I lived in Arizona. My mom had taken my best buddy and me to night fishing, and like we did almost every weekend, we got to our usual spot. My mom pops the trunk for us to get our gear, and we both stop and just look around the area. Got a strange feeling in the pit of our stomachs. And my friend, he's saying we should probably go to one of our other usual spots. I shrugged it off, grabbed my gear, and got about 10 feet from the car when I got a feeling like I was punched in the gut. I looked back. He was still by the car and agreed we needed to go elsewhere. So we got to our other spot. Everything feels fine. And we had an awesome summer night of fishing until about midnight. We were out on this dock probably 100 or 120 feet from shore, and out of nowhere, a monsoon kicks up. Literally out of nowhere. 1 minute it's nice and calm, no wind, no nothing. The next, there's debris and dirt and all kinds of crap flying through the air, and the rain and lightning kick on. We throw crap in our boxes, cut our lines, and sprint up to the car. On the half-hour drive home, we had about 30 feet of visibility and at least 60-mile-per-hour winds. If we had stayed at our first place, we would have been hit harder as it was at the mouth of this little canyon, and we would have been down a 15 to 20-foot hill. Same buddy as before, except I was night fishing with his stepdad and two brothers. When we got to this cove, we saw a couple of police cars a few coves over, but really didn't pay any attention to it. We went down and started fishing, but soon we're seeing a ton of boats going up and down the river in front of our cove. Then a helicopter joins the search. It hovers about 50 feet from the water surface, and it's spotlighting everywhere. We came to the assumption that someone drowned or got thrown from a boat earlier in the day. The boats and choppers were still doing their thing, and we see something floating out in the middle of our cove. And we all start getting on edge and just know it's probably who they're looking for, and the current is carrying him straight to us. Turns out it was a plastic grocery bag, but it had us spooked. Turned out that the cove we saw the cop cars at was the site of a drowning. Divers found the guy and a 10-foot hole in the bottom of the lake. This was back in 2005, during the hunting season in Montana. We went down by the Weiss River to try somewhere new, since my little hunting party had all or opening week off. We got there, set up camp. There was still a few hours before the sun went down. Everybody wanted to stay in camp and BS and have a few beers, but I headed out to get a feel for the area. Everything was fine and dandy, seeing a lot of elk and deer signs and thinking we're going to have a great time hunting. Then I found a couple of logs that were quite obviously on the business end of a grizzly's claws recently. My alertness goes up, and I start to head back to camp. But I have this nagging feeling. I stopped about every 10 feet and looked around. Nothing's there, but I can't shake the feeling. I finally push it to the back of my mind and just trudge onwards. Well, as I come around this little mound of dead fall, there's this insane racket and movement right in front of me. Well, it was no grizzly, but 4 grouse that had been sitting on the end of the deadfall. The stupid birds got cursed, and needless to say, when I got back to camp, I had to change my pants. This is back in 2004. I came up to visit my mom and stepdad. They picked me up in Billings, and we swung down through Little Bighorn and into Wyoming and camped for the night. Next day, we did it quickly through Yellowstone and planned to camp somewhere outside of it and drive back to Helena the next day. They liked to camp with nobody around, so we exited the park and found this little road to go down. We wound around in the trees for ages on this road, barely wide enough for a compact car, and we were in an F-250. We come to this little hill, and we followed the curve to go up it. But there's a truck parked in the middle of the road on the hill, and it has tree limbs and brush stacked around it. We decided we needed to get out of the area as a really bad feeling washed over the 3 of us. We backed down until we got the truck turned around and went out of there a lot quicker than we got in. Well, on our way out, this little red Neo Metro-like car comes speeding up behind us and stays right on our bumper. Now, we're all really on edge. We turn to go back out to the main road, but he follows, never slowing down. We turned the wrong way on the road, and we came to the end of the pavement, but it continued in dirt, and we went down to a ratty mobile home. We pulled to the side of the road. My stepdad grabbed his pistol, and the car flew past us, went behind the house, came around the other side to face us, and turned his lights off, and just sat there. We turned around and floored it back in the right direction and got back on the main road. We went down it a couple more miles before we pulled off another dirt road and found a place to sleep. We weren't there for 5 minutes, and that nervous feeling was still on all 3 of us when we saw a flashlight moving back and forth through the woods beyond where we were parked. Once more, we got the hell out of the area as fast as we could, ended up just driving through the night back to Helena. We never did find out what that was all about, but we're sure it was either poaching or meth related. Next story. My wife's family is Native American. They have from time to time sweats. This is a form of prayer and cleansing. During the sweat, you go inside a teepee-shaped tent, usually a frame of wood covered by leather or tarps. In the center of the tent, they dig a hole in the ground. They heat up big rocks in a fire until they are red hot, then they put the rocks in the hole. Everyone participating in the sweat sits inside encircling the rocks. Then they close up the tent and begin to throw water on the rocks. Steam forms in the tent, and it gets very hot, a lot hotter than a sauna. The second sweat I attended in New Mexico, it was my father-in-law's house, was really the first one that I got proper instruction on the do's and don'ts. So we got into the sweat lodge, and they threw in 6 or 7 rocks inside the hole, and the last rock they threw in kind of bounced out of the hole and partially landed outside of the hole right in front of me. I could already feel the heat from the rock near my leg. The sweat began, and as they poured water, I could feel the extreme heat going up my body. I remember what my wife had told me, but I felt like I was going to faint. Not uncommon for that to happen there. So I moved my back as far as I could, leaning it on the tent wall, and I looked up, trying to avoid the heat as much as possible. About a minute or so after I did this, I feel a push on my back, like if someone was standing outside, pushing on my back. It wasn't hard, and at first I thought maybe I was imagining it, so I stayed there, and a few seconds later I felt another push, this time a little rougher. I was so startled I almost jumped into the hole with the rocks. This was in my father-in-law's house in New Mexico, and he owns a big property. There is no way there was anyone outside doing that to me. We were there alone. I later told my wife what had happened, and she said it was most likely spirits telling me to do it right. The whole thing startled me, but not really in a bad way. Then another story happened a few years later. I was at home here in Miami when I was alone with my dog, and my dog is very calm and she hardly ever barks. Maybe if she sees a cat, she'll whine, but never even barks about that. So I was at home alone with her, and all of a sudden, I hear her start to bark. I had never heard that dog bark in this way, the kind of bark you get when you walk in front of a house that has a mean dog, and you know if the dog were to get out, it would tear you to pieces. So I got a little startled, and I went to see what she was doing. And I find her in a room where my wife had left an old briefcase where she kept things they used in Native American ceremonies. My dog was standing right in front of the briefcase, which was standing up with the handles up, and she was scratching at the floor right in front of it. She kept barking and barking. That really startled me. I had to pull her by the collar and kind of slap her around to stop her. I told my father-in-law about that, and he said spirits are attracted to that stuff because that's what they use in ceremonies. And I wonder if that's what my dog was sensing and barking at. Next story. When I was a boy, my parents used to take me and my older sister to my relative's house in eastern Kentucky, right around Letcher County. The closest city was Whitesburg. My uncle, who taught me everything I know about the outdoors, lived in a cabin nestled in a holler way back up in the mountains. His place was at the base of a big strip mine seam up on the mountainside. As a boy, he and I used to go and sit out on his back porch at night and use predator calls to try and call something down out of the hills. Well, one night, he and I were out there using one of his tapes. We'd been out there for a good 2 hours and seen nothing, so we were thinking of calling it a night. We were about to pack everything up when he realized his squirrel feeder was empty. He then decided to go fill it back up with seed. His feeder was about 50 yards away from the cabin on the mountainside and bordered the tree line. He walked up the hillside about 25 yards when his wife came out to see why we were still outside. The only light out that night was the light from his porch. He was about 35 yards up the hill, and he called back and said he forgot his flashlight. So his wife, my aunt, went back inside and got one of his spotlights. We had forgotten to turn off the tape with the predator calls on it, so I reached down to the tape player to turn it off when I noticed my aunt was as stiff as a board. I hit the off button and looked up at her, and she had the spotlight shining straight up to the squirrel feeder where my uncle was at. I heard her say, "It's coming to you, Jim." Jim is my uncle's name. He turned back and goes, "Huh?" Then a little louder that time she goes, "It's coming straight towards you, Jim." That's when I looked up and saw a set of eye shines about 15 feet away from where my uncle was standing and closing in. Whatever it was massive. The eyes were about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. Also, whatever that creature was, completely and totally got the drop on my uncle, who has pretty much spent his whole life in the woods, studying and tracking predators. Well, he just turned around looking at us with his back to the woods, so we told him to freeze. We all just kind of stood there for about 3 minutes, which seemed like a lifetime. It was dead silent. No crickets, no sounds of the night. It was the most eerie and creepy 3 minutes of my life. It just sat there at the tree line staring at all of us, and we were staring right back at it. The brush at the tree line was thick, so we could not see what shape it was, just the eyes, and where they were in relation to the ground. After those 3 minutes, my uncle slowly turned around to see what was about 15 feet away from him. With our spotlight on it, as he was about to turn and look it directly in the eyes, it split. And for the next 15 minutes, we could hear limbs cracking and snapping all the way up the side of the mountain as this animal decided to retreat. Scared the you-know-what out of me and my uncle, literally. My uncle, yep, he shit on himself. I think that was the thing that scared me the most about it, was that he was so scared. He was shaking, and I had never seen him like that. The other thing that scared us both is that we had been sitting out there all night, listening intently and watching that tree line like hawks. Whatever animal or creature it was did not make a single sound coming down the side of that mountain. It never made a sound until it took off. I didn't sleep that night, and neither did my aunt or uncle. Next story. When I was in my early teens, my family and I began to notice small dead animals appearing around our home and property. After the first week of this, we began to become a little paranoid about who or what was doing this. A little research by my father showed that our area had been known for some witchcraft rituals back in the day. Associated with the witchcraft practices were the placing of small piles of stones stacked on top of one another. Within the next few weeks, we began to spot small piles of rocks forming near our home and in the community. One day, I happened to be a quarter mile from my home down a dirt road and along a gravel path next to a large creek. While I was milling about, I caught a glimpse of something very peculiar. In the middle of the creek, on top of a large boulder, there was a stack of rocks about 3 feet high. It gave me the willies to see that, knowing what it might be symbolic of. Another time, my dad happened to look out of our back porch window and saw amongst the scrub grass and underbrush a pile of stones about 2 feet high and positioned so there would be a hole in the center of the pile. My dad investigated and looked through the hole. Our house was perfectly centered in it. By mid-spring, I decided to take a video camera and do a little investigating in the woods behind my home. Dressed in my woodland BDUs and combat boots, I headed off to see what I might uncover. Before entering the forest, I saw a dead garter snake with its head pulled off. It was a little spooky. 50 yards into the wilderness, I found what appeared to be a bird that looked like it had exploded. Feathers, blood, and body parts were scattered. I ended up going down into a marsh to check the soft ground for tracks and could not find anything for the first hour of trying. I was getting a little tired and I went over to some hard ground, plopped myself down and took a breather. There was still a few patches of snow in the area and I happened to look down at the one next to me. What I saw sent chills through my body. A human footprint, size larger than my 10.5 boots, which I would estimate was 11 to 12 inches. I could see the toes, the arch, the heel. Plopping my dad's VHS camcorder on my shoulder, I filmed the print next to my foot for comparison. Seeing that print spooked the heck out of me, and I quickly left the area and showed my video findings to my dad, mom, and sister. They quickly thought I was making up the entire story of the footprint, even when I showed them the videotape of it. I asked how I could make up such a large footprint with my own foot, considering my foot was smaller. They had no explanation and began to wonder if something was really out there. Over 15 years later, I still have not been able to explain the large footprint. Why would someone travel all the way out into a marsh just to put their bare foot into the already melting patch of snow? Was it a joke? Was someone watching me and managed to determine what direction I was heading and placed a track? Or maybe it really was something else. The dead animal occurrences tended to cease after that day and have not returned. Next story. A few years ago, I was watching TV late at night and couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. We always keep the blinds open a few inches at the bottom so the cats don't tear them up. I went over to see if anything was outside and couldn't see anything. The next day, I found some footprints in the flower beds outside the window, and someone had cut the screen. That spring, I was working second shift at my full-time job and third shift at my part-time job. I was getting off at work at 2 a.m. in a small town with about 12 miles of the twistiest roads in the county. I usually rode my motorcycle, and since I was very familiar with the area, I knew I could push the speed limit without really worrying about tickets. I was really hauling, pushing 90 to 100 miles per hour, and got this terrible feeling in my gut. I brought it back down to a reasonable speed when something short, grayish, smaller than man size, bolted across the road. It really freaked me out. I'm very Christian and don't really believe in aliens, but if I had to take a guess, this guy would have been it. It could also have been a deer or a dog with mange, I don't know. It was freaking fast. I dropped a couple of gears and pressed on. I don't stop on county roads in the middle of the night voluntarily. On another night, on the same road, I pulled over for something between two cornfields. I fidgeted with my gloves or my helmet or something. I got this feeling of being watched. I shone my flashlight around for a moment, didn't see anything, but wasn't in the mood to find out what was out there. I took off and went home. I avoid that road at night now. Now, I've also been a fan of John Keel's Mothman Prophecies book since I was about 12. I had always wanted to visit the Point Pleasant, West Virginia area to see the landmarks mentioned in the book. And last spring, I had written from Columbus, Ohio to the Dragon and made my way to Sioux, Georgia to camp out at two-wheel only motorcycle campground. It had rained most of the trip and I was fed up with camping. My friend and I decided to leave 2 days early and grab a hotel in the next town. The next morning, he had a low-speed accident on the bike and decided to shut it down and go straight back home. I opted to take the bike through Cherokee National Forest into Kentucky, then go north into West Virginia. I stayed at a hotel on the Ohio side of the river for the night and went to a gas station in the morning to fill up and ask for directions. I drove around the TNT area for a little bit and had a hard time finding the deer hunter guardrail that marks the access road for the bunkers. You can't drive back there, you have to walk it. I walked up there, went inside the main bunker that the Mothman was originally seen at. I shone my flashlight around, was extremely spooked the entire time. I just could not shake this uneasy feeling. I hightailed it out of there and went straight home. Next story. Where I grew up as a child behind our house was the end of town. It was nothing but open valley floor and sparse patches of forest. I was always a very explorative child, a trait I got from my dad, and constantly found myself spending my summers exploring all the land behind our house. There was an open field about 2 miles from my parents' house that had 3 very large oak trees that formed a peculiar triangle. I had been there many times before, and with each visit, there was this odd odor that hung in the air. I would only notice it inside the large triangle of the trees. Later in life, I learned that the smell was of death. One of the last times I ever made my way to those trees was when I stumbled upon a pile of dead ducks. It must have been at least 50 or 60 dead ducks in the middle of the 3 trees. I didn't know where they came from or who put them there. There weren't any lakes close by, and no roads led to the site. It wasn't until my late teens that I saw a similar pile of dead ducks out in the canals that border my hometown. I came to find out from a friend that it was some sort of local cult that performed the killings and pilings of the ducks. My other experience took place a mile or so away from the oak trees. It was an abandoned farm that I only visited one time. On the property was a white 2-bedroom farmhouse, wrap-around porch, a dinner bell, red trim, and lots of windows. Adjacent to the house was a very dilapidated barn. As I entered the house, what appeared to be a hunter came walking around the corner from the kitchen, rifle in hand. He was just over 6 feet tall, short brown hair, mustache, and beard, dressed in a plaid long-sleeve jeans and boots. He was very nice and introduced himself as Jim, and he said that he was hunting rabbits in the area. He began to tell me about the house, the barn, and the family that lived there. He said the family just up and abandoned their farm one day and were never seen again. They left all their belongings and took nothing with them. This was clearly evident in the house. We walked out to the barn where he showed me in old black and white photos of the farm and the family. I couldn't believe everything was just left behind. Well, we said our farewells, and he invited me and my parents to join him and his wife for dinner sometime. He said you could see his house from behind the barn and that it was just a couple of miles away. As I was walking away from the barn, I got this terrible nagging feeling. Something in my head was telling me to go back to that house and look around some more. I went back, snooped around a bit. I realized Jim was gone. I looked all over the place, outside and in the barn. I walked behind the barn to see if I could see Jim walking back home, and there was nothing. Nobody was around. I looked in the direction that Jim told me he lived, and there was nothing. A couple of days later, I braved up enough to look for Jim's house. I found it all right, or at least where a house once stood. All that was left was a burnt-out foundation. There was nothing else around the area, just plain fields and low grass. Lastly, because I was just a kid and had to share these stories and places with my dad, we went out one weekend so I could show him what I saw. I took him to the 3 oak trees and confirmed to him the smell of death in the area, and we went to the abandoned farm, followed by a short walk to the burnt-out foundation. My dad was very intrigued by all of this because he had similar, albeit much more frightening experiences when he was my age at that time. We ran into some Union Pacific Railroad tracks and decided to take them in a roundabout way back home. On our way, we found another abandoned, or so we thought, shanty. We started walking towards it when, about 50 yards from the front door, every fiber of my being was screaming at me to stop. My dad got a little stiff-legged, and before I said anything, told him we should just leave right now. I never could make myself go anywhere near that shanty, rundown place. I've been out there a couple of times since, and it's still standing, and to this day, I can't get close to it. The feeling gets so overwhelming sometimes that I can't even stand to look at the structure.